A woman is driving alone at night when she glances in her rearview mirror and sees a vehicle bearing down on her. The car continues to follow her on her winding route, rattling the driver. The mystery man even flashes his brights every so often. Finally pulling into a gas station for help, the woman goes running out of her car. When confronted by a policeman or pedestrian, the stalker reveals his true motivation. He noticed that a man was lurking in the woman's back seat and kept flashing his lights every time he reared up to try and strangle her. Versions of this story began appearing as early as the 1960s, with the victim alternately a teenager driving home from a school play or a woman coming back from a social engagement. Occasionally, the tale would be a massive commercial truck that seemed ready to run her over. The fake-out savior might be a gas attendant, a husband, or a cop who roughs up the stalker before his altruistic intention is finally revealed. At least half of the tale is grounded in reality. Over the years, there have been several incidences of lurkers who have stowed away in the rear seat of vehicles, emerging to attack drivers or simply to evade capture by police. In 1964, one criminal made the mistake of hiding in a car owned by a police officer. The detective turned and fired on his uninvited passenger. The addition of a good Samaritan who notices the danger and tails the terrified driver appears to be pure embellishment, however. Hitchhikers typically don't make life easy for the characters in folk history, and this one is no exception. Typically, the story picks up when a couple of young men are driving along and spot an attractive woman walking on the side of the road. They pick her up and she tells them she'd like to go straight home. The drivers indulge her, but by the time they make it to the address she's provided, she's fast asleep. Not wishing to disturb her, the men go to the door and inform the woman, who answers that her daughter is dozing in their back seat. The woman is perplexed. Her daughter has been dead for years. When they return to the car, the passenger is gone, with only her clothes remaining. One of the most flexible urban legends of all time, the Vanishing Hitchhiker has been traced as far back as the 19th century, where horse and wagon rides took the place of a car. In Hawaiian versions, the ghost has even been picked up in a rickshaw. The apparition might have a warning before disappearing. In other versions, she's known to have died a violent or tragic death while in the process of returning home. The appeal of a spirit with unfinished business in life seems to have no cultural boundaries. Researchers have found variations of the tale in countries like Algeria, Romania, and Pakistan. There's even a Swedish tale that was first mentioned in 1602 of a ghostly woman walking along a road who warned two passers-by of impending plagues and wars before disappearing. In the dead of night, a child, or, in some versions, a young or old woman, hears some strange noises. For comfort, the kid lets his or her hand dangle off the edge of the bed so their dog can lick it in a comforting gesture. The process might repeat itself throughout the night, with the child receiving a few more wet kisses before morning. When the child wakes up and begins walking around the house, they might find the dog hanging from a noose, or worse, their parents bludgeoned to death. A bloody note reads, "Humans can lick, too." In the dead of night, a child, or, in some versions, a young or old woman, hears some strange noises. For comfort, the kid lets his or her hand dangle off the edge of the bed so their dog can lick it in a comforting gesture. The process might repeat itself throughout the night, with the child receiving a few more wet kisses before morning. When the child wakes up and begins walking around the house, they might find the dog hanging from a noose, or worse, their parents bludgeoned to death. A bloody note reads, "Humans can lick, too."
Two lovers meet and grow consumed with one another. But as their meetings become more frequent, the man becomes curious about the fact that his girlfriend always wears a green ribbon tied around her neck. Time and again, he asks if it's significant. She always answers that it is, but she can't elaborate. Before long, the man grows frustrated at how coy she's being about the ribbon. Despite his anger, she refuses to take it off, or explain why it's important. Finally, he takes a pair of scissors to her sleeping frame, snips the fabric, and watches as her head slides off her neck and goes bouncing to the floor. Unlike many legends, there's really no pretense that the story has roots in reality. Typically, the punchline evokes laughter and shock. Some versions have the woman cautioning that her lover will be sorry if he pushes the issue, then admonishes him with a "told you," as her head travels across the floor. In all likelihood, it was writer Washington Irving who got the ball, or cranium, rolling. Irving published a short story in 1824 titled The Adventures of a German Student, where a young man becomes enamored with a Parisian woman whom he meets while she looks on mournfully near a guillotine. After consummating their mutual attraction, she's found dead in his bed the next morning. A policeman undoes a ribbon tied around her neck, prompting her head to slide off. Irving's poor protagonist is quickly committed to an insane asylum. It's believed that Irving heard this story from his friend, the Irish poet Thomas Moore, who had heard it from the British writer Horace Smith. Two young lovers are parked in a make-out spot when a news story breaks on the radio. A killer has escaped from custody, with his sole distinguishing feature being a hook in place of an amputated hand. The woman is unsettled and implores her lover to lock the car doors, which he does. But the thought of the hook crashing through the window begins to consume her, and she pleads for them to drive off. Annoyed, the boyfriend agrees. When he drops her at home, she exits the car and notices that a hook is dangling from the door handle. Aside from the hook hand twist, couples who parked in designated lovers' lane spaces had plenty of reason to be terrified. A former military man named Clarence Hill was convicted in 1942 of several murders in Pennsylvania, with Hill creeping up on unsuspecting car occupants and shooting them through the windows. These attacks and others made for ripe stories over avoiding necking in parked cars in the 1960s. Even Ann Landers printed the tale as a warning to hormonal teens. A teenage girl agrees to sit for a trio of young children while their parents enjoy a night out. At first, the evening is almost mundane. With the kids in bed, the sitter chats with friends and finds ways to pass the time. But then the phone begins to ring. On the line is a sinister voice who advises her to check the children. After multiple calls, the sitter finally dials the police, who phone back with a shocking warning: the calls have been coming from inside the house. The murderous caller was upstairs with the children the entire time. Thanks to the 1979 film When a Stranger Calls, which used this story as the premise for its riveting opening sequence, this might be the most infamous urban legend of all time. The story has been widely told since 1960, with some versions indicating both the children and the sitter meet a bloody end. The emergence of the story seems to coincide with a rush of media reports about babysitters who were assaulted or even murdered in the 50s and 60s, lending credence to the idea that it likely came out of a fear of leaving a vulnerable young woman alone in a strange house. Some folklore theorists have also observed that the man upstairs conceit spoke to a cultural rebellion over women taking increasingly dominant positions in society instead of adhering to their role as domestic caretakers. Left to her own devices, the babysitter fails to protect the children from harm. Was it anti-feminist propaganda? Perhaps. But the babysitter who isn't alone trope also speaks to a pretty primal fear of being helpless to guard yourself or others from unseen forces. And two-line phones.